I was walking back to my dorm after grabbing dinner, just a typical Tuesday evening with my backpack slung over one shoulder and a half-eaten burrito in my hand, when I saw them standing there in the hallway outside my door, and my stomach immediately dropped because I knew something was seriously wrong. My girlfriend's dad with two police officers, both in full uniform with their badges gleaming under the fluorescent lights of the dormitory hallway, standing outside my door like they were waiting for me, like predators who had finally cornered their prey. The dad's arms were crossed tightly across his chest, his jaw clenched so hard I could see the muscles working even from down the hall, and the officers stood on either side of him with that practiced, neutral expression that cops always seem to have, the one that gives absolutely nothing away. Oh man, what now? I thought, my mind racing through every possible scenario, every potential thing I could have done wrong, but coming up completely blank because I genuinely had no idea what this could be about. "There he is," the dad said, pointing at me with an accusatory finger that trembled slightly with barely contained rage. His voice was cold and angry, cutting through the quiet hallway like a knife, and I could hear the hatred dripping from every syllable. One of the officers stepped forward, his hand resting casually on his belt near his radio, and I noticed how his eyes scanned me up and down, assessing, judging, already forming conclusions. "Are you Paolo?" he asked, though it was clear from the dad's reaction that they already knew exactly who I was. "Yeah. What's going on?" I managed to get out, though my voice sounded weak and uncertain even to my own ears, and I could feel my palms starting to sweat as the burrito in my hand suddenly felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. "We need to talk to you about some serious allegations," the officer said, his tone professional but with an edge of severity that made my blood run cold. "Regarding inappropriate contact with a minor." My heart started pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears, feel it hammering against my ribcage like it was trying to escape my chest. "What? What are you talking about?" I stammered, genuinely confused and terrified because those words, inappropriate contact with a minor, were about the worst thing anyone could ever be accused of, the kind of accusation that could destroy your entire life in an instant. The dad's face scowled and went fully red, transforming from angry to absolutely livid in the span of a heartbeat, the color rising from his neck to his forehead like a thermometer measuring pure fury. "You know exactly what this is about. My daughter. You picked her up from school today without my permission," he snarled, and I could see a vein pulsing in his temple, could see his fists clenching and unclenching at his sides like he was physically restraining himself from lunging at me. "I was just giving her a ride home. My girlfriend asked me to." I protested, my voice rising in pitch as panic started to really set in, because this was insane, absolutely insane, and surely they would understand that it was just a simple favor, nothing sinister at all. "Let's take this inside," the second officer said, gesturing to my door with a calm authority that somehow made everything feel even more serious, more real, more terrifying. My hands shook as I unlocked it, fumbling with my keys so badly that it took 3 tries to get the key into the lock, and I could feel all 3 of them watching me, judging every nervous movement I made as further evidence of my guilt. This couldn't be happening. I kept thinking over and over like a mantra. This absolutely could not be happening to me. Inside, the lead officer pulled out a notepad, flipping it open to a fresh page with practiced efficiency, while the second officer positioned himself near the door, blocking my only exit, and the dad stood there in the middle of my tiny dorm room radiating pure hatred. "We have a statement from the victim claiming you've been texting her privately. Inappropriate messages," the lead officer said, and that word victim hit me like a physical blow because it implied that I had done something, that I was guilty of something terrible. "Victim? No, that's not," I started to say, but the dad shoved his phone in my face, so close I had to lean back to focus on it. Screenshots, dozens of them, messages that looked flirtatious and completely damning. "When will you be alone?" One of them read in what appeared to be my texting style. "Can't wait to see you," said another, and my vision started to blur around the edges as I read message after message that I had never sent, had never even thought about sending. "Those aren't from me. I don't even have her number," I practically shouted, desperately pulling out my own phone with hands that were now shaking so violently I nearly dropped it. I fumbled for my girlfriend, trying to call her because she would explain everything. She would tell them that this was all a huge misunderstanding, that I had only picked up her sister because she had specifically asked me to. The phone rang and rang and rang, each unanswered ring feeling like another nail in my coffin. She's always glued to her phone unless I need her, I thought bitterly, and of course this would be the one time she decides not to answer. "She's not answering," the second officer observed, writing something down in his own notepad, and I could only imagine what he was writing, what terrible conclusions he was drawing from my girlfriend's silence. "Because she's probably disgusted," the dad spat, his voice breaking slightly with emotion that sounded like a mixture of rage and grief. "She probably can't believe her boyfriend is a predator," and that word, predator, felt like a punch to the gut, like being branded with a scarlet letter that I would never be able to remove. "I'm not, please, you have to believe me," I begged, hearing the desperation in my own voice and hating how pathetic I sounded, but being completely unable to stop myself. The lead officer cut me off with a raised hand. "We pulled security footage from the high school. Shows you sitting in your car outside the building at 3:15 p.m. Waiting," he said, and the way he emphasized that last word made it sound predatory, sinister, like I had been lurking there with malicious intent. Yes, because my girlfriend asked me to pick her up, I insisted, but even to my own ears it was starting to sound like a weak excuse, and I could see in their faces that they had heard it all before, that every guilty person probably said something similar. Son, if that were true, why wouldn't you call the parents first? The officer's tone was skeptical, professional, like he'd heard every excuse before, and mine wasn't even particularly creative. The dad's voice cracked with raw emotion. My daughter has been acting strange for weeks, secretive, staying out late. Now I know why, he said, and I could hear the pain beneath the anger, could see a father who genuinely believed his daughter had been victimized. His hands balled into fists that turned white at the knuckles. You've been grooming her, he accused, and that word hung in the air like poison. No, I swear I was just... But right then my roommate's door opened, the sound of the knob turning impossibly loud in the tense silence. He stepped out, his hair disheveled and his eyes bloodshot, confused by the commotion and clearly completely unprepared for what he was walking into. Do you know about this? The lead officer asked him, turning his attention to this new potential witness. Did your roommate mention picking up a high school student today? My roommate's eyes went wide as he processed the scene before him, the two cops, the angry father, me looking like I was about to have a complete breakdown. No? I didn't know anything about that, I think, he stammered, clearly stoned out of his mind and probably not even fully comprehending what was being asked of him. Perfect, I thought with rising hysteria. That stoner was making me look even more guilty now, making it seem like I had been hiding something, sneaking around, keeping secrets. The officers exchanged glances, one of those wordless communications that law enforcement officers seem to have perfected, and the lead one made another note in his pad, his pen scratching across the paper with finality. Your story isn't adding up. No witnesses, no proof. Your girlfriend won't answer, he said, listing each piece of evidence against me like he was building a case, and I could feel the walls closing in around me. The dad stepped closer, invading my personal space until his face was inches from mine, close enough that I could smell coffee on his breath and see the broken blood vessels in his eyes from what must have been hours of crying. Where did you take her? What did you do to my little girl? He demanded, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper that was somehow more threatening than when he had been yelling. Nothing! I dropped her off at your house, that's it! I protested, my back literally against the wall now as I tried to put some distance between us. You're lying! He screamed, his face contorted with rage and anguish and absolute certainty that I was a monster. Every word I said made it worse. Every explanation sounded like an excuse. Every defense seemed to dig me deeper into a hole I couldn't climb out of. I could see it in their faces, in the way the officers looked at me with disgust, in the way the dad looked at me like I was the lowest form of life on earth. They didn't believe me, nobody believed me, and I was starting to wonder if maybe I should just call a lawyer and stop talking entirely. Then the door burst open with such force it slammed against the wall, and my girlfriend stormed in like an avenging angel, dragging her younger sister by the arm with such force the poor girl was practically being hauled off her feet. The sister's face was red and puffy from crying, her mascara running down her cheeks in black streams, and she looked absolutely terrified. My girlfriend's expression was furious, more angry than I had ever seen her, and for a moment I wasn't sure if she was on my side or about to join the lynch mob. Tell them, my girlfriend demanded, squeezing her sister's arm hard enough that I could see her fingers turning white. Tell them what you told me. The sister was shaking like a leaf in a hurricane, sobbing so hard she could barely breathe. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry, she managed to choke out between gasps. Tell them, you little turd, my girlfriend shouted, giving her sister a shake that made the girl's teeth rattle. I lied, the sister wailed, the words exploding out of her like they had been building pressure for hours. He didn't do anything. I made it up. The room went silent. Absolutely silent, like someone had hit a mute button on the entire universe. I've been sneaking out to see someone. It's really complicated, you wouldn't understand. I needed a cover story, so She couldn't finish, just kept crying, her whole body heaving with sobs. My girlfriend thrust her phone at her dad with such force he actually flinched. Look, I texted him this morning asking him to pick her up because I had a meeting. It's right here. Timestamps and everything, she said, her voice shaking with fury at her sister and relief that I was innocent. The lead officer took the phone carefully, like it was a piece of fragile evidence. He examined it carefully, scrolling through the messages with slow deliberation, his expression shifting from skeptical to confused to slightly embarrassed. His expression shifted from hard certainty to something softer, something that might have been regret. He turned to me, and I could see the apology forming in his eyes before he even spoke. You're free to go, he said simply, and those 3 words felt like being pulled back from the edge of a cliff. The dad's face drained of color in an instant, the angry red fading to a sickly pale white as the reality of what he had almost done crashed over him. Rage became horror, became embarrassment in the span of seconds, emotions flickering across his face like a slideshow. Oh my God, I almost... His voice was barely a whisper, strangled and broken. I'm so sorry. I could have ruined your life. But wait, he continued, his brain clearly trying to process everything at once. What do you mean by, it's complicated exactly? The second officer suddenly moved toward the door, his body language shifting from official to nervous in an instant. I need to leave. Another call came in, he said abruptly, reaching for the door handle with what seemed like desperation. The sister looked up from her hands where she had been hiding her face, and her face went completely white, all the blood draining away until she looked like she might pass out. Henry, wait! She blurted out without thinking, then slapped both hands over her mouth like she could somehow shove the words back in, her eyes going wide with absolute horror at what she had just revealed. The lead officer froze mid-step, his entire body going rigid. Slowly, deliberately, he turned to his partner with an expression of dawning realization and disgust. How does she know your first name? Update. Henry's face went from pale to almost gray as he took another step backward toward the door, and his hand moved from his radio to his belt like he was checking for an escape route or maybe reaching for something to defend himself with. The lead officer moved fast, positioning his body directly between Henry and the exit with a smooth, practiced motion that made it clear he'd done this kind of thing before. And suddenly the whole dynamic in my tiny dorm room shifted completely, because now Henry wasn't the authority figure anymore. He was the suspect. The lead officer's posture changed from casual professional to something harder, more alert. Like a switch had been flipped inside him, and he was seeing his partner with completely new eyes that saw a threat instead of a colleague. Henry opened his mouth and words started tumbling out in this rushed, panicked way that sounded nothing like the calm, professional voice he'd been using just minutes earlier when he was investigating me. She must have seen my name badge. Kids see badges and remember names. It doesn't mean anything, he stammered. But his voice cracked right in the middle, and everyone in the room could hear the lie in it, could see the way his eyes kept darting toward the door like a trapped animal looking for any way out. The sister's sobbing got louder and more desperate as she shook her head violently back and forth, her whole body trembling so hard I could see it from across the room, and she tried to cover her face with both hands like she could hide from what she'd just accidentally revealed. My girlfriend's grip on her sister's arm tightened until her knuckles went white, and she pulled the girl closer with this protective, fierce motion that made it clear she believed what was happening even if she didn't want to. The lead officer's hand went to his own radio, and he pressed the button with deliberate force, his voice coming out hard and official in a way that made my skin prickle, because I'd heard that exact tone directed at me just minutes ago when I was the one being accused. Dispatch, I need backup at the university dormitory, Building C, room 312, immediately, he said into the radio, never taking his eyes off Henry for even a second, and I could hear the response crackle back with an acknowledgement that units were on their way. Then he turned fully to face Henry and started reading him his rights in this mechanical, practiced way that felt surreal. Because just 10 minutes ago, these two had been working together to investigate me, and now one was arresting the other right here in my room. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law, the lead officer said. And Henry's face went through this whole series of expressions, from shock to denial to anger to something that looked almost like resignation. Henry tried one more time to deflect, his voice getting higher and more desperate as he insisted the sister was confused, that she was clearly upset and mixing things up, that maybe she knew his name from some school safety presentation he'd done months ago. Kids get confused. She's been through trauma tonight with all these accusations. She doesn't know what she's saying. Henry kept talking faster. And faster, like if he could just find the right words he could make everyone believe him and walk out of here like nothing had happened. But the sister was crying even harder now and shaking her head no over and over again, and my girlfriend was staring at Henry with this look of absolute horror and disgust that made it clear she knew exactly what had been going on. I stood there frozen against my wall watching this whole thing unfold like I was watching a movie instead of real life happening right in front of me. And I felt this weird mix of sick relief that I was off the hook combined with residual terror that was still making my hands shake and my heart pound. The sound of footsteps pounding up the stairs echoed through the hallway, and within what felt like seconds, but was probably closer to 3 or 4 minutes, 2 more officers burst through my door with their hands near their weapons and alert expressions scanning the room for whatever emergency had prompted the backup call. The lead officer gave them a quick rundown in this clipped professional voice, pointing at Henry and explaining that there was evidence of inappropriate contact with a minor and that Henry needed to be taken into custody immediately for questioning. Henry started protesting louder, his voice rising to almost a shout as he insisted this was all a huge mistake, and demanded to speak to his union representative, but one of the new officers was already pulling out handcuffs and moving behind him with practiced efficiency. The metallic click of the cuffs closing around Henry's wrists was one of the loudest sounds I'd ever heard, echoing in my small room and making everything feel suddenly very real and very serious. Henry's face crumpled as they started reading him his rights again and leading him toward the door. And he kept turning his head back toward the sister, like he wanted to say something to her, but couldn't find the words, or maybe knew anything he said would just make things worse. The girlfriend's father stood frozen in the middle of my room, looking like he might actually throw up, his face pale and his eyes wide with shock as he watched a police officer get arrested in his presence. And I could see him processing what this meant, that his daughter had been involved with this man, that he'd almost destroyed my life over lies meant to cover up something so much worse. The lead officer stayed behind as the other two escorted Henry out into the hallway, and I could hear Henry's voice getting fainter as they took him down the stairs, still protesting his innocence in that desperate way that made him sound more guilty with every word. The lead officer closed my door softly after they left and turned back to face everyone remaining in the room with an expression that was professional but clearly disgusted, like he'd just discovered something rotten that had been hiding in plain sight. He pulled out his notepad again and flipped to a fresh page, then looked at the sister with eyes that were gentle despite everything that had just happened, and asked if she was okay to answer some questions about her relationship with Officer Henry. The sister nodded weakly while still crying, and my girlfriend kept one arm around her shoulders in this protective gesture that showed she was furious at her sister for lying about me, but also recognized that her sister was a victim of something terrible. The dad finally moved from his frozen position and sank down onto my desk chair like his legs couldn't hold him up anymore, and he put his head in his hands with his elbows on his knees in this posture of complete defeat. The lead officer started asking questions in this careful, measured way, keeping his voice calm and non-threatening, as he asked when the sister first met Henry, how they started communicating, what kind of things he said to her. The sister's answers came out between sobs, talking about how Henry had pulled her over a few months ago, when she was driving her mom's car, how he'd been so nice and friendly, and made her feel special by saying she seemed mature for her age. My roommate had disappeared back into his room at some point during all this chaos, probably wanting nothing to do with whatever was unfolding. And I didn't blame him one bit because this whole situation was so far beyond normal college drama that it felt like something from a TV show instead of real life. After what felt like hours but was probably closer to 45 minutes, the lead officer finally closed his notepad and stood up from where he'd been sitting on the edge of my bed conducting the interview. He looked at all of us with this expression that was part sympathy and part professional duty as he explained that a detective would need to do a formal interview with the sister tomorrow, with her parents present, and that they'd need written statements from everyone who was here tonight. He handed out business cards to the dad and to my girlfriend, then turned to me specifically and apologized in this quiet, sincere way that somehow made everything feel even more overwhelming. "I'm sorry you went through that," he said, gesturing vaguely at the room like it could encompass everything that had happened in the last 2 hours, and I just nodded because I didn't trust my voice to work properly if I tried to speak. The dad stood up slowly like he'd aged 10 years in the last hour, and he looked at me with eyes that were red and watery like he'd been crying or was about to start. He opened his mouth like he wanted to say something, some apology or explanation, but nothing came out, and he just closed it again and shook his head. The lead officer told them they could go home for tonight, but to expect a call from the detective's office first thing in the morning, and he ushered them toward the door with gentle professional courtesy that was such a contrast to how he'd treated me earlier that it made my head spin. My girlfriend paused at the door and looked back at me with this expression that was so full of horror and guilt and confusion that it physically hurt to see it, and she mouthed, "I'm sorry," before following her family out into the hallway. The next day started with my phone ringing at 8 in the morning, the sound dragging me out of a restless sleep filled with bad dreams about being arrested and accused of things I didn't do. A detective whose voice was calm and professional explained that he needed to interview the sister formally with her parents present, and that the investigation into Officer Henry was now officially open. I spent the morning in my room trying to focus on homework, but mostly just staring at my textbook without actually reading anything, my mind replaying the previous night over and over like a video stuck on repeat. My girlfriend texted me around noon saying the interview was happening at the police station and asking if I was okay, and I texted back that I was fine, even though I definitely wasn't. Later that afternoon, she called me and told me everything that came out during the formal interview, her voice shaking as she described what the detective had uncovered about Henry's months-long pattern of grooming her sister. Henry had pulled the sister over for a fake traffic violation when she was driving her mom's car to pick up groceries, claiming her taillight was out even though it wasn't. He'd been super friendly and charming during the stop, making jokes and asking about her school, and her plans for college, and at the end he'd gotten her number by saying he needed it for the police report, even though that wasn't actually required for a simple warning. Then he started texting her constantly, always late at night when he knew her parents would be asleep, sending compliments about how pretty she was and how mature she seemed compared to other girls her age. The sister admitted to the detective that she knew it was wrong, that she knew he was way too old, and that she shouldn't be talking to a police officer like that, but she felt special that an older guy with authority and a uniform was paying attention to her. When her parents started asking questions about why she was always on her phone and acting secretive, she panicked and needed a cover story fast, so she blamed me to deflect their attention away from what was really happening. I went back to classes 2 days later because I couldn't afford to miss any more time, but the whole experience felt wrong and uncomfortable in ways I couldn't fully explain. Walking across campus, I felt like everyone was staring at me, even though logically I knew the story hadn't spread beyond the people who were directly involved, but paranoia had settled into my brain and wouldn't leave. Every time I saw a police car driving past campus or parked near a building, my heart rate would spike, and I'd feel this surge of panic that made my palms sweat and my breathing get shallow. In my biology lecture, I couldn't concentrate at all on what the professor was saying about cellular respiration, because I kept replaying that moment when the dad called me a predator and showed those fake texts to the police. My hands shook when I tried to take notes, making my handwriting come out all messy and illegible, and I gave up after a few minutes and just sat there staring at my blank page. The girl sitting next to me kept glancing over with this concerned expression, but I avoided making eye contact because I didn't want to explain why I was acting so weird. By the time my afternoon lecture rolled around, I was having what I'm pretty sure was a panic attack, my chest feeling tight, and my vision getting kind of blurry around the edges, so I grabbed my backpack and left early, practically running out of the lecture hall before anyone could ask if I was okay. 4 days after that night in my dorm, someone knocked on my door in the late afternoon, and when I opened it cautiously, I found the girlfriend's father standing there alone, looking like he hadn't slept since everything happened. His eyes were bloodshot and had dark circles under them, his clothes looked wrinkled like he'd slept in them, and he'd clearly lost weight because his shirt hung looser than it should have. He asked if he could come in and talk to me, his voice quiet and hesitant in a way that was completely different from how he'd sounded that night, when he was accusing me of terrible things. I let him in because what else was I supposed to do, and he sat down on my desk chair and started apologizing in this broken voice that kept cracking with emotion. For almost an hour he talked about how sorry he was, how he could have ruined my entire life with his rush to judgment, how he didn't even give me a chance to explain before assuming the absolute worst about me. He kept saying he was a father trying to protect his daughter, and he let his fear and anger take over his common sense, and that he'd never forgive himself for what he almost did to an innocent person. I sat on my bed listening to him talk and accepting his apology, because what else could I do? But inside I was still feeling this weird mix of understanding and resentment. I understood he was scared for his daughter, but I couldn't shake the memory of him showing those fake texts to police and calling me a predator with such absolute certainty in his voice. A week after everything happened, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize, and when I answered, it was the detective who'd interviewed the sister. His voice had this edge of controlled anger as he explained that they'd been digging into Officer Henry's background and uncovered evidence that he'd been under investigation before for inappropriate contact with teenagers, but the previous complaints had been dismissed as misunderstandings by his department. I felt this huge surge of rage building in my chest as I listened to him explain how the system had failed so badly that a predator got to keep his badge and gun and access to potential victims. The detective sounded genuinely angry too, as he told me they were now building a much bigger case against Henry, looking into every interaction he'd had with minors during his time on the force, and that I might be called to testify about what happened that night in my dorm. I told him I'd testify if needed, because I wanted Henry to face real consequences, and also because I almost became collateral damage in his crimes when the sister used me as her cover story. 2 weeks later, I was still having nightmares about police showing up to arrest me, waking up in the middle of the night with my heart pounding and my sheets soaked with sweat. I'd started avoiding the hallway outside my room because that's where it all happened, where I first saw them waiting for me, and just walking past that spot made my stomach twist into knots. My girlfriend noticed I flinched every time someone knocked on my door unexpectedly, and that I'd stopped eating regularly because my stomach was constantly upset and food seemed completely unappealing. One night she came over and found me sitting on my bed staring at nothing, and she asked gently if I was okay. And I finally admitted that I wasn't, that the false accusation had done something to my head that I couldn't just shake off like it was no big deal. She sat down next to me and held my hand while I tried to explain how it felt to be called a predator, and have police officers look at me with disgust, how that memory kept playing in my head on repeat no matter what I did to distract myself. The sister had to give multiple statements to build the case against Henry, and each interview revealed more disturbing details about how he'd manipulated her with classic grooming tactics that made my skin crawl. My girlfriend shared some of this information with me, her voice shaking as she described how Henry had told her sister she was mature for her age, that their connection was special and unique, that her parents wouldn't understand their relationship because society had outdated views about age differences. He'd isolated her by making her feel like nobody else could understand what they had, and he'd used his position as a police officer to make her feel like he had power and authority that made him trustworthy. My girlfriend was clearly torn between being furious at her sister for lying about me and putting me through hell, and being horrified at realizing her sister had been victimized by someone who was supposed to protect people. I could see the conflict in her face every time she talked about it, the way she'd get angry and then immediately feel guilty for being angry at a victim. 3 weeks after that night in my dorm, the detective called me with news that made my stomach turn over. 2 more girls had come forward with stories about Henry that sounded almost exactly like what happened to my girlfriend's sister. Both of them were high school students he'd met through his police work, one during a school safety presentation and another when he pulled her over for speeding. The detective's voice was calm, but I could hear anger underneath as he explained how Henry had used the same playbook with all of them, making them feel special and mature, getting their numbers for fake official reasons, then starting the grooming process through constant texts and attention. What made it worse was learning that one of the other victims' parents had actually reported Henry to the department 8 months ago, but were told there wasn't enough evidence to pursue an investigation. The system had failed these girls completely, letting a predator keep his badge and access to more potential victims, and I felt sick knowing that Monster had been walking around in a uniform while actively targeting teenagers. The detective told me he was sharing this information so I'd understand the bigger picture of what was happening and why my situation mattered. So much to the case they were building. I thanked him and hung up, then sat on my bed staring at nothing for probably 20 minutes while my brain tried to process how many lives Henry had damaged. My relationship with my girlfriend started falling apart the following Sunday when she asked if I wanted to come to her family's house for dinner. I told her I couldn't do that yet, that I wasn't ready to sit at a table with her father and pretend everything was fine. She got defensive immediately, her voice rising as she insisted her dad had apologized multiple times and felt terrible about what happened. I snapped back that his apology didn't erase the memory of him shoving those fake texts in my face and calling me a predator in front of police officers. She started crying and said I was being unfair, that her dad was suffering too and beating himself up over his mistakes. I raised my voice and told her that her dad almost destroyed my entire life based on lies, and I had every right to need more time before I could face him. We went back and forth like that for almost an hour, both of us saying things we didn't mean, both of us crying and getting angrier. She accused me of holding a grudge and not being willing to forgive. I accused her of not understanding the trauma of being falsely accused of something so horrible. Eventually, she grabbed her jacket and left my dorm without saying goodbye, slamming the door hard enough that my roommate stuck his head out to see what was happening. I sat there alone, feeling like everything was falling apart and not knowing how to fix it. The campus rumors started spreading around that same time, even though I had no idea how people found out about the police incident. I'd be walking to class and notice groups of students looking at me and whispering, their voices dropping when I got close enough to hear. Someone in my biology lecture asked me directly if I was the guy who got arrested, and when I said no, I wasn't arrested, they gave me this skeptical look like I was obviously lying to cover something up. The whispers and stares got worse every day until I started dreading leaving my dorm room at all. I began skipping classes that weren't absolutely required for my major because facing the social anxiety was just too much. Sitting in a lecture hall knowing people were probably talking about me and making assumptions about what happened felt impossible. My attendance got so bad that professors started emailing me asking if everything was okay, which just made me feel more stressed about the whole situation. I stopped going to the dining hall and started ordering food delivery to my room because I couldn't handle eating in public spaces where people might recognize me and stare. Meanwhile, my girlfriend's family was completely falling apart as they tried to process everything that had happened to her sister. My girlfriend told me her mom was blaming her dad for being too strict and controlling, saying he pushed their daughter toward rebellion by not giving her enough freedom or trust. Her dad was blaming himself for missing all the warning signs that something was wrong with his daughter and for rushing to judgment about me instead of asking real questions about what was actually going on. He kept saying he should have noticed his daughter was acting different, should have investigated who she was really spending time with instead of accepting her lies about me. My girlfriend was stuck in the middle of all this family drama, trying to support her sister through the trauma of what Henry did, while also maintaining our increasingly strained relationship and dealing with her own guilt about not seeing what was happening. She told me her parents were barely speaking to each other except to argue, and her sister was in therapy twice a week, but still having nightmares and panic attacks. The whole family dynamic had been destroyed by Henry's actions and the sister's lies, and there was no easy path to healing any of it. A month after the incident, the lead officer who'd been there that night called me personally to tell me that formal charges had been filed against Henry. Multiple counts of sexual misconduct with minors and abuse of authority, each one carrying serious prison time if convicted. I could hear satisfaction in the officer's voice as he explained they were taking down one of their own who had betrayed everything the badge was supposed to represent. He also mentioned something I hadn't even considered, that I could potentially pursue a civil case against Henry for defamation and emotional distress, given what the false accusations had done to my mental health and reputation. The idea of suing Henry hadn't crossed my mind because I'd been so focused on just surviving each day, but the officer said I should think about it because I had a strong case for damages. I thanked him for the call and the information, then added his suggestion to the growing list of things I needed to figure out about my future. My parents flew in the following weekend and took me to meet with a lawyer they'd hired to discuss my legal options. The lawyer was professional and straightforward, as he explained I had solid grounds for a civil case against Henry, given the documented trauma and potential harm to my reputation. He laid out what we could potentially recover in damages, including therapy costs, lost wages if my grades suffered enough to impact my future career, and compensation for emotional distress. But then he warned me that suing my girlfriend's family for their role in the false accusations could permanently destroy my relationship with her. He asked me directly what I wanted more, revenge or the ability to move forward with my life. I told him honestly that I didn't know, that part of me wanted everyone who hurt me to face consequences, but another part just wanted to heal and move on. He said I should take time to think about it carefully, because once we filed a lawsuit, there would be no taking it back. I left his office feeling more confused than when I arrived, carrying paperwork I wasn't sure I'd ever sign. 6 weeks after everything happened, a third victim came forward. This one a college student who Henry had been involved with when she was in high school 2 years ago. The detective called to tell me about her, explaining she'd been too scared to report what happened before, but seeing the other cases in the news gave her courage to speak up. Her testimony was crucial because it established Henry's pattern of predatory behavior over multiple years, showing this wasn't just recent bad judgment, but a long-term problem. The detective's voice had this edge of excitement, as he told me each new victim made the case stronger, and Henry's chances of avoiding serious prison time kept getting smaller. He said the prosecutor was building an airtight case that would be almost impossible for Henry's lawyer to defend against. I should have felt relieved or vindicated, but mostly I just felt tired and sad that there were so many victims and that the system had let Henry operate for so long. My grades were completely falling apart by this point because I'd missed so many classes and couldn't focus on assignments when I did try to work on them. I got an email from my academic advisor asking me to come in for a meeting about my sudden decline in performance. I sat in her office trying to hold it together as she pulled up my transcript showing failing grades in 3 classes and incomplete assignments in 2 others. She asked gently what was going on, and I just broke down crying right there in her office and told her everything that had happened. She listened without interrupting, her expression getting more concerned as I described the false accusation, the trauma, the ongoing investigation, the relationship problems, everything. When I finished, she was incredibly kind as she explained my options for salvaging the semester. She helped me file for incomplete grades in 2 classes where I could make up the work over winter break and medical withdrawal from another class that was too far gone to save. She also suggested strongly that I should talk to a campus counselor because what I'd been through was serious trauma that needed professional help. I'd been avoiding counseling because I didn't want to admit how much this had affected me, but sitting in her office crying, I realized I couldn't keep pretending I was fine. My girlfriend showed up at my dorm late one night about a week after that advisor meeting. I could tell from her face she'd been crying before she even said anything. She sat on my bed and told me she thought we needed to take a break because the situation was too hard on both of us. Her voice shook as she explained that she loved me but couldn't handle being torn between me and her family anymore, that every time we were together she was reminded of what her sister did and what her father almost did to me. She said she needed space to deal with her own guilt and help her family heal without feeling like she was betraying me by maintaining relationships with them. I wanted to argue and fight for us, but I was too tired and hurt to find the words. Part of me knew she was right, that we couldn't build a healthy relationship while carrying all this trauma and family drama. So I just nodded and watched her stand up and walk to the door. She paused with her hand on the doorknob and looked back at me with tears running down her face, then left without saying anything else. I sat there in the silence of my empty room feeling completely alone. 2 months after the initial incident, the police department announced an internal investigation into how Henry's previous complaints had been handled and why he was allowed to continue working with access to potential victims. The local news picked up the story and ran several segments about systemic failures in the department, though they were careful not to name any of the victims. I watched the news coverage from my dorm room and recognized enough details to know my situation was part of what they were investigating. They interviewed the lead officer who talked about the need for better oversight and accountability when complaints come in about officers. It felt validating in a weird way that people were finally taking this seriously as a bigger problem than just one bad cop, that they were looking at how the system failed to protect people. The news coverage made me feel slightly less alone, like maybe my trauma mattered in some larger context of fixing things, so this couldn't happen to others. The next week, I was walking through the student union trying to get to my afternoon class when my chest suddenly got tight and my vision started going fuzzy around the edges. I couldn't breathe right, and my hands started shaking so bad I had to sit down on one of the benches near the food court. People were walking past me and I could feel them staring, but I couldn't focus on anything except trying to get air into my lungs. My heart was racing, so fast I thought something was seriously wrong with me, like maybe I was having a heart attack even though I'm only 20 years old. After about 10 minutes of sitting there trying to calm down, I pulled out my phone and searched for the campus counseling center number. My hands were still shaking as I called and asked for an appointment, and the person on the phone must have heard something in my voice because they got me scheduled for the next day. The counselor turned out to be this woman probably in her 50s with kind eyes and a calm voice that made me feel slightly less like I was losing my mind. I sat in her office with its comfortable chairs and soft lighting and told her everything about that night in my dorm, about being called a predator, about the nightmares, and the constant fear, and the way I couldn't stop replaying those moments over and over. She listened without judging me, and when I finished talking, she explained that what I went through was real trauma and that my panic attacks and nightmares were completely normal reactions. Hearing her say that somehow made me feel less broken, like maybe I wasn't crazy for still being messed up about something that happened weeks ago. She scheduled me for weekly appointments and gave me some breathing exercises to use when I felt panic coming on. 2 days after that first counseling session, I opened my email and saw a message from my girlfriend's sister with the subject line just saying, "I'm sorry." My finger hovered over the delete button for a solid minute before I finally clicked to open it. The email was long, probably 1,000 words or more, and she wrote about how guilty she felt for what she did to me. She explained that she never meant for things to go as far as they did, that she just panicked when her parents started asking questions, and my name came out before she could think. She wrote about how the lie grew bigger than she could control, and by the time the police showed up at my door, she was too scared to stop it. The email talked about her therapy sessions and how she was dealing with what Officer Henry did to her and the choices she made. She said she understood if I never forgave her, but she needed me to know how sorry she was for almost destroying my life. I read the whole thing twice, and then just sat there staring at my computer screen, not knowing what to feel. Part of me was still angry at her for putting me through hell, but another part recognized she was a kid who got manipulated by a predator and made bad choices out of fear. I didn't respond to the email, but I moved it to a folder instead of deleting it, because maybe someday I'd be ready to write back. 3 months had passed since that night when someone knocked on my dorm door late on a Tuesday afternoon. I opened it to find a woman in professional clothes holding a notebook and a press badge hanging around her neck. She introduced herself as a reporter from the local news station and said she wanted to interview me about being falsely accused. My stomach dropped immediately, and I asked her how she got my name because the police and prosecutor had promised to keep the victims' identities private. She gave me this apologetic smile and said sources talk, and she thought my story deserved to be told. I told her I wasn't interested in any interview and tried to close the door, but she kept talking, saying how important it was for people to understand what false accusations can do. I shut the door in her face and immediately called campus security to report that a reporter was harassing students in the dorms. Then I called my parents in a panic because I was scared the news would run my name anyway, and it would follow me forever. My dad said they'd handle it, and the next day they had a lawyer send a letter to the news station threatening legal action if they published my identity. The station backed off, but the whole thing left me feeling exposed and vulnerable in a new way I hadn't experienced before. A week after the reporter incident, the prosecutor called me with news that made my hands start shaking again. Officer Henry's defense lawyer had filed motions trying to get my girlfriend's sister's testimony thrown out of court. The lawyer was arguing that she was an unreliable witness because she'd already admitted to lying once when she blamed me. The prosecutor explained that they needed to establish the timeline of when the sister's relationship with Henry got exposed, and that meant I might need to testify about the false accusation. She asked if I'd be willing to take the stand and describe what happened that night in my dorm when the sister accidentally said Henry's name. I sat there on my bed feeling sick to my stomach because the thought of sitting in a courtroom talking about being called a predator made me want to throw up. But I also knew that if I didn't testify, Henry might get away with what he did to those girls. I told the prosecutor I'd do it because staying silent felt like letting that monster win, and I couldn't live with myself if the system failed again because I was too scared to speak up. After I agreed to testify, I spent the next 2 weeks working with my counselor on managing my anxiety about facing Henry in court. She had me practice telling my story over and over until I could get through it without my voice shaking or my hands trembling. We did breathing exercises and visualization techniques where I imagined myself staying calm on the witness stand. My parents flew in from home to support me, and that helped more than I expected because having them there made me feel less alone. Then my girlfriend texted me out of nowhere saying she heard I was testifying and asking if I wanted her to be there. I stared at that text for probably 20 minutes before responding that yes, I'd like her there if she was willing. Her response came back fast, saying she'd be there no matter what. Reading those words made something shift in my chest, and I realized I still loved her despite everything that had happened between us. The break had been hard, but maybe we needed that time apart to figure out what we really wanted. The day after my girlfriend texted about being at the trial, I asked if she wanted to meet for coffee to talk about everything. We met at this quiet cafe off campus where we used to go all the time before everything fell apart. Sitting across from her felt weird at first, like we were strangers who used to know each other really well. She started by saying she was sorry for suggesting the break when I needed support the most. I told her I was sorry too for being so focused on my own trauma that I didn't think about how much she was hurting watching her sister go through this. We talked for almost 3 hours about how hard the past few months had been and how we both made mistakes in how we handled things. She admitted her family was still a mess with her parents barely speaking and her sister struggling in therapy. I told her about my panic attacks and nightmares and how I was finally getting help. By the end of the conversation, we both agreed we wanted to try again, but we needed to do it differently this time. We decided to take things slow and be more honest about our feelings instead of bottling everything up. We also set clear boundaries about her family, because I still wasn't ready to sit at their dinner table and pretend everything was fine. 4 months after that terrible night in my dorm, I walked into a courtroom wearing the one suit I owned and feeling like I might pass out. The prosecutor had prepared me for what to expect, but actually being there with Henry sitting at the defense table made my heart race. When they called my name, I stood up and walked to the witness stand on legs that felt like they might give out. I put my hand on the Bible and swore to tell the truth, and then sat down facing the prosecutor. She asked me to describe what happened the night the police came to my dorm, and I took a deep breath before starting. I told the court about seeing them waiting outside my door, about being accused of inappropriate contact with a minor, about the fake text messages, and being called a predator. Henry's lawyer objected a few times, but the judge let me continue. When it was the defense lawyer's turn to question me, he tried to make me look unreliable by pointing out that I'd been eating a burrito during a serious police confrontation. The prosecutor objected, and the judge told the defense to focus on relevant facts. I kept my voice steady as I described the moment when my girlfriend's sister accidentally called Henry by his first name, and everyone realized what was really happening. I looked at Henry once during my testimony, and his face was completely blank like he felt nothing about what he'd done. After I finished testifying, I sat in the gallery to watch my girlfriend's sister take the stand. She looked so much younger than she had that night in my dorm, sitting there in a conservative dress with her hair pulled back. The prosecutor asked her to describe her relationship with Henry, and she started crying before she even got the first words out, but her voice was strong as she explained how he pulled her over for a fake traffic violation and got her number. She talked about the constant texts and compliments and how he made her feel special and mature. Then she described how scared she was when her parents started asking questions about her behavior and how she panicked and blamed me without thinking about the consequences. She looked directly at Henry as she spoke, and I watched his face stay completely blank the whole time. That blank expression somehow made him seem even more guilty, because a normal person would show some emotion, some remorse, something. The defense lawyer tried to poke holes in her story, but she didn't back down, and by the end of her testimony, I could see some of the jury members wiping their eyes. The trial didn't end up going to a jury because 2 days after the sister testified, Henry's lawyer approached the prosecutor about a plea deal. Henry agreed to plead guilty to multiple counts of sexual misconduct with minors and abuse of authority in exchange for a sentence of 8 to 15 years. The prosecutor called to tell me about the deal, and I felt this weird mix of relief and anger, because 8 years didn't seem like enough time for what he did. She explained that a plea deal meant a guaranteed conviction versus the risk of a trial where anything could happen. I understood the logic, but it still felt wrong that he might get out in 8 years and get to have a life after destroying so many others. The sentencing hearing happened a week later, and I went to watch even though I didn't have to be there. My girlfriend's father was there too, sitting a few rows behind me, and when the judge called Henry's actions a betrayal of public trust, the father broke down crying. I turned around and saw him with his face in his hands and his shoulders shaking, and I felt this complicated mix of sympathy and residual anger, because he'd been so quick to believe the worst about me. The semester ended 2 weeks after Henry's sentencing, and I somehow managed to salvage my grades enough to stay enrolled. My GPA took a serious hit from all the classes I'd missed, and the assignments I couldn't focus on completing. I met with my academic advisor to figure out what to do next, and she was incredibly understanding about everything I'd been through. She helped me plan a lighter course load for the next semester, with classes that wouldn't be as demanding while I continued working on my mental health. She also connected me with a peer support group for students dealing with trauma, which I was hesitant about at first, but decided to try. The first meeting was awkward because I didn't know anyone, but hearing other people talk about their struggles made me feel less alone. I shared a little bit about what happened to me without going into too many details, and people nodded like they understood. Walking out of that meeting, I felt something I hadn't felt in months, like maybe I wasn't completely broken, and maybe I could actually heal from this. I still had nightmares sometimes, and unexpected knocks on my door still made my heart race, but I was starting to believe I'd be okay eventually. I'd learned that asking for help wasn't weakness, and that trauma doesn't just go away because you want it to. You have to work through it one day at a time. 5 months crawled by in this weird mix of getting better and still feeling broken, and one Tuesday afternoon my phone buzzed with a text from my girlfriend's dad asking if he could meet me at the campus coffee shop to talk. I stared at that message for probably 10 minutes before responding, yes, my stomach twisting into knots because I hadn't seen him since that awful sentencing hearing where he broke down crying. The coffee shop was mostly empty when I arrived, just a few students studying in the corner, and he was already sitting at a table near the window looking older than I remembered. His hair had more gray in it, and the lines around his eyes seemed deeper, like the past 5 months had aged him years instead of months. He stood up when he saw me and extended his hand for a formal handshake, which felt weird and awkward, but I took it anyway. We sat down and he started apologizing again, his voice quiet and shaky as he went through everything he'd already said before about rushing to judgment and almost destroying my life. Then he pulled out an envelope and slid it across the table toward me, explaining it was a check to cover my therapy costs and any other expenses related to what happened that night. I opened the envelope and saw it was for $5,000, which was way more than I expected, and my hand started shaking as I held it. He told me he knew money couldn't fix what he did, but he wanted to help in whatever way he could, that he'd been talking to his own therapist about how to make amends for his mistakes. I accepted the check because therapy was expensive and eating through my savings fast. But I also told him honestly that our relationship would never be what it could have been if he'd given me a chance to explain that night instead of assuming I was a monster. His face crumpled a bit when I said that, and he nodded slowly, his eyes getting watery as he admitted he understood completely. He said he'd spend the rest of his life trying to make better choices and be less quick to judge people, that what happened taught him he didn't know his own daughter as well as he thought, and that scared him more than anything. We sat there for another 20 minutes making uncomfortable small talk about school and the weather, both of us knowing this would probably be the last time we'd meet like this, that our relationship would always be defined by that terrible night in my dorm. The new semester started 3 weeks later, and I walked into my first class feeling that familiar anxiety creeping up my spine. But something was different this time. Nobody stared at me when I found a seat in the middle row. Nobody whispered or pointed or gave me those suspicious looks I'd gotten used to over the past months. Campus had moved on to other drama, other scandals and gossip that replaced my situation in the collective memory of students who barely knew me anyway. I sat through the entire lecture without my heart racing or my hands shaking, actually taking notes on what the professor was saying about molecular biology instead of obsessing over whether people were talking about me. My girlfriend met me after class and we walked to the student union together, her hand finding mine naturally like it used to before everything fell apart. We'd been taking things slow since getting back together, having honest conversations about our feelings instead of bottling everything up, and it was working better than I expected. She told me her sister was doing okay in therapy, that the family was still healing but making progress, and I listened without that surge of anger I used to feel whenever her sister got mentioned. We grabbed lunch and sat outside on one of the benches near the fountain, just talking about normal stuff like assignments and plans for spring break, and for the first time in months I felt like maybe we could actually build something real together. The terrible way our relationship got tested either destroys couples or makes them stronger, and somehow we were ending up in the second category. I still had bad days where the memories hit hard, and I'd spiral into anxiety about police or accusations or my reputation, but those days were getting less frequent, and I was learning how to manage them better with the tools my counselor taught me. My girlfriend noticed when I was having a rough day and knew how to help without making me feel weak or broken, and I was getting better at telling her what I needed instead of pretending everything was fine. 6 months after that night in my dorm, the local news ran a story about the police department announcing major policy changes in how they handle complaints about officers and interact with minors. I was eating breakfast in my dorm when the notification popped up on my phone, and I clicked through to read the full article with my heart pounding. The changes included better training on recognizing grooming behavior, stricter oversight of officers who work with young people, and a new independent review board to investigate complaints that used to get dismissed as misunderstandings. The article mentioned my case without naming me, talking about how a college student was falsely accused by a minor who was actually being victimized by an officer, and how that situation exposed serious problems in how the department operated. My phone rang an hour later, and it was the lead officer who'd been there that night, the one who figured out what Henry was really doing. His voice sounded proud as he explained that my situation and the other victims' courage to come forward helped push these reforms through the city council and police administration. He said the department fought against the changes at first, claiming they were already doing enough, but the public pressure and media attention made it impossible to ignore the systemic failures anymore. I thanked him for calling and told him I was glad something positive came from all the pain, even though it didn't fix what happened to me or the other girls Henry hurt. He agreed and said he hoped I was doing better, that he still felt terrible about how that night went down in my dorm before the truth came out. After we hung up, I sat there staring at my phone, feeling this complicated mix of validation and sadness, because policy changes were good, but they couldn't give me back those months of trauma and anxiety and nightmares. My girlfriend called me later that afternoon after seeing the news story, her voice excited as she talked about how meaningful it was that our terrible experience might prevent future victims. I agreed with her, but also admitted I still felt angry sometimes that it took multiple girls getting hurt and my life nearly getting destroyed before anyone took the problem seriously. I'm doing genuinely better now, though I still see my counselor every Wednesday afternoon, and probably will for a long time because trauma doesn't just disappear when you want it to. The nightmares are less frequent, maybe once or twice a month instead of every night, and I can handle unexpected knocks on my door without my heart trying to escape my chest. My relationship with my girlfriend is stronger than I ever thought possible after what we went through, because we survived something that could have destroyed us, and came out the other side still choosing each other. We learned how to communicate better and be honest about our feelings, instead of assuming the other person knows what we're thinking or needs. I've learned I'm more tough than I thought, that I can handle terrible things happening and still get up the next day and keep going forward. The scars are still there, both the emotional ones from being called a predator, and the psychological ones from having my life almost fall apart based on lies, but they don't control me anymore like they did those first few months. I'm even considering changing my major to criminal justice because I want to help fix the system that almost failed me so badly. Want to be part of making sure what happened to me and those girls doesn't happen to other people. My academic advisor thinks it's a good idea and says my personal experience would make me a stronger advocate for reform and victims' rights. Life isn't perfect, and I still have days where I struggle with anxiety or trust issues or anger about everything that happened, but I'm moving forward one day at a time, and that's enough for now. My girlfriend and I talk about the future sometimes, about where we'll be in a year or 5 years, and those conversations don't scare me anymore like they used to when I couldn't imagine surviving the next week. I deposited that check from her father and used it to pay for therapy, and to build up my savings again after months of barely scraping by, and while the money helped, practically it also represented something bigger about accountability and trying to make things right. The semester is going well, and my grades are back up to where they were before everything happened, proving I can succeed academically even after trauma tried to derail my entire college experience. Sometimes I walk past that hallway outside my old dorm room and remember seeing them standing there waiting for me. Remember that moment of pure terror, when I thought my life was over, but now I can keep walking without falling apart, because I know I survived the worst thing I could imagine, and I'm still here.